What if your loved one was never buried at all? What if the coffin you wept over held nothing but straw? Or worse, something that wasn't even human? In the year 1877, the city of St. Louis prided itself on modern progress. Gas lamps, steel bridges, and the quiet illusion of order. But beneath that polished veneer, rot festered in the soil. And at its center stood a man known only for his calm hands, spotless apron, and unwavering silence. They called him Alpheus Griggs, the city's most trusted municipal undertaker. A gaunt, clean-shaven figure who spoke little and charged even less. When no family came to claim the dead, when the sick, the poor, the orphaned, and the unnamed passed from the world, it was Griggs who laid them to rest, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. And for nearly 2 decades no one asked what he did with the bodies, until they started coming back. Not the people, just the stories. The open caskets that felt too light, the graves that sank overnight, the grieving mother who begged to see her son's face one last time, only to be turned away by Griggs himself, the same mother who waited in the dark and saw him rolling barrels toward a covered wagon long after midnight. Soon after, the Missouri River, swollen from spring flood, spat up a coffin, sealed, pristine, and very much empty. That was when the whispers began. About how the Undertaker, who sold the bodies he buried, wasn't just a grotesque rumor, but a man sanctioned by a broken system. A man who had turned death itself into a ledgered business, and how the graves beneath St. Louis might not hold the dead, but only the illusion of burial. This is the story of betrayal, not just of families, but of an entire city. A betrayal written in false ledgers, stolen remains, and the sickening smell of lavender burning in a room that never saw light, because Alpheus Griggs didn't bury the dead. He traffickers, ed them, and when the truth clawed its way from the earth, the city tried to bury that too. But some graves refused to stay closed. After the Civil War, St. Louis became a city bloated with grief. It was a junction of wounds, geographically central, spiritually hollow. The war had ended, but its rot lingered in the form of amputated men, shell-shocked children, and newly emancipated families crammed into collapsing tenements. Then came the fevers, typhoid, diphtheria, yellow death with no pattern or mercy. Add to it factory accidents, railway explosions, burnt tenement rows, and you had a city hemorrhaging bodies faster than it could count them. The problem wasn't just death. It was the paperwork of death. The bodies of the poor, the unnamed, the sickly, those without plots or relatives, began piling up in alleyways and hospital cellars. The city needed someone to make the corpses disappear, and Alpheus Griggs fit the role perfectly. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't campaign. He didn't need to. He showed up one morning at City Hall in a neatly pressed coat, handed over a detailed burial proposal with cost-saving estimates, and left without waiting for a reply. The city called it a divine solution. Griggs never missed a pickup. He buried at sunrise. His paperwork was always clean, his manners always somber. He quoted scripture without sounding sanctimonious, and he worked cheap. He never advertised. He never asked for a raise. When his name first appeared in the municipal registry of 1865, no one questioned it. By 1870, his contract was automatic, renewed without review, like some dependable ghost that just kept collecting bodies. He was always seen, but never really noticed. A silhouette beside a cart, a pair of gloved hands folding a burial shroud. A man who closed every lid with reverence and never ever lifted it again. Griggs had no wife, no known family, no friends who spoke of him. His small brownstone funeral home sat on the edge of a slum and never lit its upstairs windows. But to the city he was a godsend. He asked no questions, and in return, neither did they. because forgetting is cheaper than remembering, especially when there's profit in the silence. The world of medicine was advancing. Bones needed names, muscles needed maps, and nothing taught the living quite like the dead. But there was a problem. Anatomy schools couldn't get enough bodies. Most churches forbade dissection. Families wanted full burials. Legal donations were rare, and unclaimed corpses were bureaucratic nightmares. So, a darker system emerged. A market fueled by unmarked graves and midnight shipments. And in St. Louis, the city unknowingly sat atop one of its busiest suppliers. Alpheus Griggs never planned to become a trafficker, at least not at first, but opportunity, like rot, grows silently. In 1868, a letter arrived at his mortuary from a doctor in Springfield. It was polite, distant, and precise. The man requested a male specimen under 16, preferably intact. In exchange, he offered $50 in gold, nearly 3 months of Griggs's salary. The boy had died in a cholera ward that, mourning, no family, no record, no name. Griggs filled the coffin with bricks, signed the burial form, and sent the real body north by wagon under a shipment of salted pork. The payment arrived a week later. So did 3 more letters. By year's end, he was keeping 2 books, one for the city and one for himself. One listed burial dates, cemetery plots, and false identifiers. The other listed names, ages, causes of death, and destinations. St. Louis thought it had buried over 200 souls that winter. In truth, 83 were sold. Some went to Chicago, others to Philadelphia. A few vanished entirely, rerouted to private collectors, unsanctioned schools, and institutions that never asked where the flesh came from. Griggs began to think of the dead not as people, but as inventory, categorized by age, gender, and freshness. To him, the cemetery was no longer a place of mourning. It was a warehouse. He didn't bury people. He catalogued them. And behind his calm eyes and folded hands, he began to understand something terrible. The dead were worth more than the living, so long as no one looked too closely at the dirt. Behind the mortuary's prayer room, behind the shelves of dusty hymnals and velvet-lined casket brochures, was a door that didn't creak. It wasn't locked. It was concealed, flush with the wood paneling, painted the same shade of lifeless brown, and nearly invisible unless you knew to knock twice and push with your shoulder. Inside, there were no windows, no crucifixes, no mourning veils, only the ledgers. Dozens of them, stacked like holy books on wooden crates soaked with brine. Each one hand-bound in black leather, stamped not with titles, but with years. Inside, rows and rows of names, some real, most invented, written in meticulous script. Next to each, a column for age, cause of death, estimated freshness, and most disturbingly, condition upon receipt. Some notes were brief. Female, 23 pneumonia, lungs intact. Others were clinical. Boy, 12, burned left side, spine usable, hands preserved. Then came the roots. Abbreviated city names, wagon numbers, departure dates, and driver initials. Griggs had mapped not just the streets of St. Louis, but a network of silent roads through the Midwest, where bodies could pass like whispers. He learned which rail agents could be bribed, which back-alley embalmers owed favors, which institutions would pay extra for female specimens, or malformed skulls, or infants. Preservation became an art form. He packed some bodies in salt-lined barrels, the kind used for fish. Others were submerged in lye baths, dissolved down to bones for osteology labs. If the corpse was fresh enough, he wrapped it in oilcloth and stored it upright in a barrel of ice, sealed with wax and hidden beneath false cargo. In time, the back room began to stink, not of rot, but of chemical discipline. Neighbors noted the strange deliveries, the ammonia scent that clung to the air on warm nights. But Griggs smiled, nodded, and offered free sermons on the dignity of Ethan. When alone, he read medical journals by candlelight, not to heal, but to understand how long each organ stayed viable how much time he had before the body became useless. He studied decomposition like scripture, and the ledgers were his gospel. The first thing anyone noticed when entering the Griggs funeral home was the smell. Not of formaldehyde or pine or the dull damp of old wood, but lavender. Always lavender. Heavy and cloying, soaked into the curtains, the floorboards, even the paper fans handed to grieving families during services. It was comforting at first, a floral promise of peace. But over time, something felt wrong. The scent was too strong, artificial, unrelenting, even in the dead of winter when no flowers grew. Children said it clung to your clothes, that it followed you home. What it concealed was far worse. Behind the heavy drapes and hymnals, Griggs stored his secrets: barrels of brine and ice, wax-sealed boxes with unfamiliar cargo, and long, narrow drawers that never quite closed all the way. Even in deep freeze, the body resists silence. It leaks. It sours. So he burned lavender oil day and night. Candles lined the walls of the back room. Bundles of dried flowers hung from the rafters, not for beauty, but to mask the seepage of death. The neighbors noticed. Of course they did. The constant freight deliveries at dusk, the men in dusty coats who left before dawn, the odd barrels marked pork, handle with care. But Griggs always smiled, always bowed. He donated to the local orphanage every spring, paid for hymn books, attended church without fail, though he never took communion. He was even known to perform free funerals for stillborn children. So the neighbors said nothing. They called him eccentric, devout, maybe a bit lonely, but harmless, until the rumors began. It started as a joke among grave diggers. Watch your back, or the resurrection man'll find you. Then whispers from hospital porters, stories of fresh corpses vanishing in the night, of carts pulled through alleyways beneath blackout cloths. No one could prove it. But when someone died in St. Louis without family, without coin, without name, it wasn't the grave they feared. It was the lavender. Because by then, the word had returned to the city's lips, resurrectionist. And every time Griggs passed by, someone whispered behind closed doors, "He doesn't bury them. He collects them." The fire began just before dawn. An oil lamp knocked over in the crowded hallway of the Clay Street workhouse, where orphans slept two to a cot and rats chewed through hymnals for bedding. By the time the flames were smothered, 37 children were dead. The city moved quickly. They blamed faulty wiring, old wood, God's will, anything but themselves. The bodies were carted to Griggs' funeral home by noon. No autopsies, no names, except one mother came. Margaret Sullivan, blind in one eye, widowed, and made harder by it, pushed through the gathered crowd outside Griggs's door. Her son, Eve, Lai, just 10 years old, had been placed in the workhouse after her illness left her unable to feed him. She came not to accuse, but to mourn. "I want to see him," she whispered. "I want to hold his hand, just once." Griggs stood still in the doorway, black gloves folded, lips thin. "I'm afraid the body was severely burned," he said. She insisted. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "No," and shut the door. But grief sharpens instinct. Margaret didn't go home. Instead, she waited in the alley beside the funeral home, tucked into a shadow, shivering in her threadbare shawl as the city dimmed. Midnight came, and so did Griggs. She saw him exit the back of the mortuary, pushing a handcart stacked with sealed barrels, wrapped in oilskin and marked in chalk. She saw him look over his shoulder once. Then he loaded the barrels into a wagon with covered sides. No driver, no lanterns, just a waiting horse and the sound of wooden wheels rolling into the dark. Margaret didn't scream. She wept, silently, as the lavender oil burned from the window above. The next morning she walked barefoot through St. Louis, blood on her soles, hair wild, eyes hollow, shouting a name no one recognized. "Griggs! He took my boy. He burned him again." People turned away. Children stared. No one stopped her. Because in St. Louis, grief was as common as dust, and mad women were easier to dismiss than buried sins. Margaret Sullivan walked barefoot for nearly 2 miles. Through ash-coated gutters, past sleeping drunks and shuttered shops, she screamed her son's name, screamed Griggs's name, screamed about barrels, wagons, and a grave that never was. No one helped her. By the time she reached the front steps of City Hall, her feet were torn open, leaving a trail of blood behind her. She pounded the doors, demanded the return of her child, begged the guards to listen. They didn't. The police report filed that morning listed her as hysterical. A grief-struck woman of low means, confused by sorrow, known to be unwell. They escorted her to a charity ward, gave her broth, told her to rest. They never asked about the wagon, but one man did listen. Thaddeus Berwick, a junior reporter for the St. Louis Tribune, overheard her cries as she was dragged from the steps. Something about the name Griggs stuck in his mind. He knew the mortician, had attended one of his services. Dull, efficient, unremarkable. But the name Eli Sullivan, it didn't appear in any city death records. Berwick visited the burned remains of the Clay Street workhouse. No list of victims had been made public. No oversight, no ledger. Just the quick, silent disposal of bodies, handled, of course, by Griggs. 3 days later, a column appeared on page 4 of the Tribune. It bore a quiet title, Whispers from the Grave. It spoke not of crimes but of coincidences, empty coffins, vanished paupers, grieving mothers silenced, a funeral home that smelled too sweet, a city that had grown far too comfortable with forgetting. The article barely made waves. Most readers skipped it, but not all. In taverns and tenement kitchens, people whispered, recalled odd deliveries, a brother who died in a factory collapse but was buried too fast, a neighbor who never found her husband's plot. No one said Griggs's name out loud, not yet. But something had cracked. Not the truth, not the silence, just the dirt. And sometimes that's all the dead need. The flood came without warning. Spring rains swelled the Mississippi River until it clawed at the banks, swallowing streets, dragging fences into the current. In the low-lying River Hollow district, water surged through the slum's forgotten cemeteries, pauper plots where names had never been carved, only scratched in wood. As the water receded, it left something behind. Coffins. Dozens of them, cheap pine boxes bloated with silt, bobbing half-sunken in ditches and alleyways. At first no one dared touch them. Then a child opened one. Inside, there was no body, just straw, stones, and in one case, a shattered porcelain doll, her painted eyes half melted by mildew. Word spread fast. By sundown, a crowd had gathered. They pried open more coffins. One held bricks, another was empty altogether. Only 2 contained remains, both skeletal and crushed under false weight. One man swore he found horse bones. Grief turned to rage. The people of River Hollow had buried their own with what little they had, candle stubs, borrowed suits, family lockets, and now they learned they'd wept over lies. Within hours the mob turned to Griggs' mortuary, but they didn't storm it. They just stood there, watching, waiting. When Griggs emerged the next morning, dressed in his usual black, he did not flinch. He addressed the city with calm clarity. "Grave robbers," he said. "Opportunists, drawn by the flood. They steal what they can and mock the dead in the process. I am as horrified as you are. He offered to assist with reburials, promised to bless every disturbed grave, even gave out free coffins to the poor. And still, the crowd did not move. Because for all his rehearsed sorrow, one truth lingered in the back of every throat. Grave robbers didn't leave dolls, they didn't replace corpses with straw, and they didn't use Griggs's signature nails, thick, square-headed, hand-forged, the kind only his mortuary used. Someone whispered it then, barely audible over the wind. He buried the coffins, but sold the bodies. And the river, having given up its dead, went silent again. It arrived in a brown paper parcel, stained at the corners, tied with twine. No return address. Just the name Thaddeus Berwick, scrawled in sharp black ink, and the St. Louis Tribune newsroom etched beneath it. The editor nearly tossed it aside, until the smell hit. When Berwick opened the package, the room fell silent. Inside was a human arm, severed at the shoulder. Pale, cold, unnaturally stiff. The flesh was clean, surgical. A fine stitch ran along the deltoid, as though someone had begun to dissect it, then stopped mid-process. Folded neatly beneath the limb was a yellowed invoice. It read, "Received. One male cadaver, Caucasian, approx. 9 years old. Condition, intact. Minor cranial fracture. Origin, St. Louis Municipal. Griggs Funeral Services. Delivered to Chicago Institute of Medical Sciences. Dated 3 weeks ago. Signed at the bottom in a tight professional hand. Dr. H. Whitford, Chief Anatomist." The city had whispered. The poor had mourned. The river had revealed fragments. But now there was proof. The Tribune printed the full story the next day, complete with a photograph of the severed limb laid across the invoice. The headline was blunt: "Bodies for sale, the Undertaker's trade." Readers recoiled. Clergymen denounced it from pulpits. Mothers burned the paper before children could see it. But it was too late. Griggs's name had entered the bloodstream of the city. No longer a whisper. Now, a sickness. More articles followed. Reporters dug into freight records. A porter confirmed weekly crates from Griggs shipped to Chicago under biological supplies. A former student at the Institute claimed to have practiced on a cadaver with a parish seal burned into its foot. And through it all, Griggs remained silent. He issued no statement, gave no interviews. He simply closed his doors, lit another lavender candle, and waited. Because he knew something the newspapers had only begun to understand. They were no longer chasing a crime. They were excavating a system. The children spoke of the man in black. They said he came after prayers when the halls of St. Agnes Orphanage fell silent and the gaslights flickered low, tall, with no face, always in black. He smelled like flowers, they whispered, but not real ones, dead ones. At first the sisters thought it was a game, just children grieving the loss of classmates in the Clay Street fire. Trauma, stirred by whispers in the street. But then the nightmares began. The youngest children woke screaming, clawing at the sheets. Some refused to sleep at all, sitting upright through the night with hands over their mouths. Then came the mock funeral. One grey afternoon, the older boys stole blankets and broomsticks and fashioned a coffin in the courtyard. The girls made paper flowers. They dressed a bundle of clothes as a child, named him Thomas, though no such boy existed. They wept, wailed, carried the bundle in solemn procession around the grounds. When the headmistress asked what they were doing, one child answered without blinking, "He died, but no one will remember him, so we had to." The teachers were horrified. Some wept. Others resigned that night and never returned. When the story reached the press, it ignited something violent beneath the city's skin. These were no longer rumors or ledgers or invoices. These were children, and whether their fears were real or imagined didn't matter. because they believed them, and the public believed them too. The story splashed across front pages. Orphans haunted by the Undertaker. St. Louis children bury the forgotten. Mock funeral exposes city's shame. Letters poured into City Hall. Sermons thundered from pulpits. Calls to close Griggs's funeral home rose from every neighborhood, poor and rich alike. The people had tolerated silence, tolerated the poor buried without names, even tolerated rumor. But now the horror had a face, and it was a child's. The Church of St. Gabriel hadn't held a service in over a decade. Once a towering symbol of immigrant faith, its bell tower had been struck by lightning in 1869. The roof collapsed in a storm months later. By 1877, its stained glass lay shattered, pews blanketed in dust, and the altar devoured by vines. But the crypt remained. Buried beneath its broken nave was a family vault sealed for generations, until a group of city inspectors arrived to assess structural damage. They pried open the heavy doors, expecting decay and forgotten tombs. What they found instead stopped them cold. Inside were bones, hundreds of them, scattered without care. Femurs, ribs, finger joints piled like discarded tools. None of the bodies had heads. There were no coffins, no grave markers, just slabs, stone platforms stained with something dark that refused to fade. Carved into the walls were symbols, not crosses, not scripture. Shapes like circles within circles, repeated triangles, a spiral etched in soot. One inspector claimed they were surgical symbols. Another whispered, "These aren't symbols, they're instructions." The bones had been cut, not with the crude brutality of grave robbers, but with precision. Smooth separations, clean lines, scalpel work. Word spread fast. What disturbed people most wasn't just the quantity of remains or the missing skulls. It was the location. Because 10 years prior, when the church was still active, it had hosted funeral rites for the city's poorest souls. And the man who led those rites was Alpheus Griggs. His name appeared in old parish records, listed as officiant and burial agent. He had access to the crypt, permission, time, silence. And now the city asked, were these not tombs, but harvesting rooms? The Tribune published photographs of the chamber, piles of bones, strange etchings, a rusted hook suspended from the ceiling. The article posed a chilling question. Was St. Gabriel a church for the living, or a temple for the dead? No one returned to the crypt after that. The archdiocese sealed it within the week. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was fear. Because if Griggs had turned a church into a slaughterhouse, where else had he buried his secrets? The ledgers were never meant to be seen. They were kept in the back room, wrapped in oilcloth, pressed between barrels of salt and sealed crates. Written in Griggs's own hand, inked in tidy, symmetrical lines, every entry like a prayer to a darker god. And then, one night, they were gone. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry, just an open cabinet, a lavender candle still burning low, and an empty space where the truth had lived for years. 3 days later, copies of the ledgers appeared in every major newsroom in St. Louis. One reporter fainted after reading the first 20 pages. The Tribune published excerpts that afternoon. May 14th, male, 19, typhoid. Sold to St. Elias Medical School, $45. June 3rd, female 62, suicide. Declined. Condition, poor. June 7th, child, approx. 8, unclaimed. Eyes intact, sold to St. Aloysius Hospital, $60. July 2nd, infant premature. Taken by private client. Name withheld. Each entry included dates, weights, estimated viability, and destination. Griggs had labelled them like produce. Worse, Many of the purchasers were public names, hospitals funded by the city, universities with state grants, even clinics operated by local clergy. One entry read simply, September 1st, 2 adult males, sold to M for embalming study. The address matched the office of Mayor Franklin Devereux. Within hours, the city exploded. Protests erupted outside City Hall. Ministers tore up government contracts during Sunday sermons. The mayor's mansion was surrounded by torch-carrying crowds chanting, "You bought the dead!" Devereux denied everything, claimed forgery, claimed setup. But he had no alibi for the missing dates, no explanation for the matching delivery schedules. His silence became admission. Within a week, 3 officials resigned, including the city coroner. One hospital closed its doors overnight, and somewhere in the city, Alpheus Griggs remained unseen. But he had set the fire, and now St. Louis was burning, not with flames, but with shame. The horror was no longer his alone. It belonged to every hand that signed a receipt, and every eye that chose not to see. He was found slumped over a bar stool in Kansas City, soaked in gin and sweat, muttering into his collar. No one knew his name, but when he spoke, he said just enough. "I pushed the death cart," he told the bartender. "I cleaned the hooks. I salted the small ones." The bartender thought he was crazy, just another drunk haunted by war or grief. But a reporter in the back corner of the saloon overheard a different name, Griggs, and leaned in. The man wore a porter's coat and carried old bruises. He said he'd worked for Griggs for nearly 6 years. No contract, no wages, just silence and room above the mortuary. When asked about the missing bodies, he laughed. "We never buried them, not really, just the bones we didn't need." He spoke of ice barrels, of brine vats, of long nights lifting limp arms and draining fluids into buckets. He described a chalkboard system. Fresh corpses were marked with letters. B for brain, H for heart, E for eyes. The dismemberment wasn't random. It was ritual, surgical. Some clients wanted full cadavers. Others just wanted pieces. Joints for arthritis study, livers for toxin testing, spines for curvature research. One man requested only tongues. He claimed Griggs kept a collection in the back room, organs that were never sold, preserved in jars, labelled in Latin. Not for science, he said, for prayer. Then the names came. Dr. Whitford, St. Elias College, the mayor, a travelling surgeon from Philadelphia, a bishop who paid in silver. The man wept after speaking, said he could still feel the eyes of the dead, said the lavender scent followed him into his sleep, curling around his throat like smoke. The reporter wired his notes back to St. Louis. By morning, the Tribune printed a new headline. "Assistant speaks, Griggs cut and sold the dead." And just like that, the whispers became testimony. A confession soaked in liquor, but clear enough to damn them all. Because one truth echoed louder than any document, louder than any invoice or bone. They hadn't buried the bodies. They'd processed them. The river gave up one last secret. 3 weeks after the ledgers leaked, a fisherman near Carondelet Landing spotted a bloated wooden barrel tangled in reeds. The sides were warped, the wax seal broken, and the chalk letters smeared by rain. But one word was still legible, faint but unmistakable: Cleveland. The fisherman opened it, expecting pork or brine waste. Instead, he found a child. A boy, no older than 10, curled like a discarded doll. His chest cavity was open, half dissected, ribs cracked cleanly, organs absent. One eye had been removed, the lid stitched shut. The skin was pale, but unnaturally preserved, like marble left too long in vinegar. Pinned to the inside of the barrel was a paper label. Shipment number 43, Cleveland Institute of Medical Sciences, via STL, urgent. The coroner confirmed what the city feared. The child had died less than 2 weeks earlier. No burial had been recorded, no name attached, no family claimed him, and the shipment, it turned out, had never arrived. The St. Louis Tribune ran the photo across its front page. Other papers followed. By sundown, the story had spread to Chicago, Cincinnati, New York. Even London printed it under the title, The Barrel Boy of St. Louis. Editorials raged, ministers wept from their pulpits, parents held their children tighter that night, and Alpheus Griggs vanished. His funeral home stood empty. Inside they found lavender candles still burning, ledgers missing, and drawers left half open like a room abandoned mid-thought. Upstairs, his bed was untouched. A basin of water sat clean beside it. The windows were shut, the curtains drawn. He had disappeared without a trace. No neighbours saw him leave. No carriage was reported. No final sermon given. Just silence. And one lingering scent, still heavy in the halls. Lavender. It wasn't just a local story anymore. Griggs had become a national horror, a legend of corruption and bones. But for the city of St. Louis, the nightmare wasn't over. Because monsters that vanish don't die. They just change their names. When the authorities finally entered Griggs's properties, it was not with ceremony, but with shovels, lanterns, and the full weight of the press at their backs. His main funeral home had already been searched, but now they turned to the places he rarely mentioned, the side buildings, the rented sheds, the abandoned cellar lots listed under false names. What they found stripped the last layer of illusion from the city's grief. Behind the mortuary, a hidden back room was uncovered, its door braced from the inside with a rusted pipe. Inside hung iron hooks, some still slick with residue. Chains dangled from overhead beams, and beneath them sat scales, perfectly balanced, stained with old matter. Glass jars lined the walls, filled with yellowing liquid. Some held organs, others held things too twisted to recognize. In the corner, 3 acid drums, tabtu, empty, one half full. Inside floated fragments of bone and linen, melted beyond identification, and stacked neatly against the far wall. Coffin lids, dozens of them, each hand-carved, labelled with a date, but no coffins, no bodies, just lids, enough to convince mourners that something had been laid to rest. Then came the worst. At a shed on the outskirts of the city, where Griggs stored his unused lumber, investigators began to dig. They struck bone within minutes. Not a skeleton, but a pit, 5 feet deep, filled with tangled remains, over 30 skulls, crushed ribs, infant jawbones, shattered spines. No order, no coffins, no ceremony, just discarded pieces. Some bore scalpel marks, others had been sawn at the joint. A few showed signs of incomplete dissection, opened, then abandoned. The stench was beyond description. Reporters were barred from the site. One officer vomited into his sleeve and had to be carried out. By the end of the week, the papers stopped calling him a mortician. They had a new word now, butcher. And for the people of St. Louis, the earth itself had become suspect. Because every patch of soil, every garden shed, every old cellar could be hiding another Griggs grave. And the dead, once again, had no peace. The journals weren't found in the funeral home. They were discovered inside a cedar chest, buried beneath loose floorboards in an abandoned rectory once owned by the Church of St. Gabriel. Hidden beneath moth-eaten vestments and old sacramental chalices were 4 black books, each bound in leather, corners worn, pages smudged by ash and oil. Every page began the same way. To Father K. May the work continue. There was no record of any Father K. in the diocese. No mention in parish logs, no funeral rites. Perhaps he never existed. Perhaps he did, and chose erasure. But the words were real. The entries were not records. They were sermons, declarations. Griggs wrote not like a man reporting, but like one preaching. He spoke of flesh as a vessel, wasted by the living, preserved by the dead. He described the human body as divine raw material, abandoned too soon to rot and worm. "We bury the sacred in filth," he wrote. "We squander God's instruments. I retrieve them." His obsession wasn't death. It was reversal. He believed each organ held echoes, vibrations of memory, emotion, even faith. That by collecting them, preserving them, and placing them in new configurations, the soul could be made whole again. "The body forgets nothing," he claimed. "If I rebuild it carefully enough, it will remember how to breathe." He blamed the living for the decay of mankind, called mourners selfish, lamented doctors who let patients die instead of offering them to the work. He praised the silence of the poor, the orphaned, the unnamed. They ask for nothing, they give everything, and they rise first. In one chilling passage, he wrote, "I have failed many times. The flesh collapses, but I am learning. The eye holds, the ear hums. I am closer now." Each letter ended the same. "Forgive me, Father K, but soon they will kneel to us both." The city read these pages with trembling hands. Beck. Or now they understood. Griggs hadn't just sold the dead. He believed he was saving them. The deeper the city dug into Griggs' past, the less of him they actually found. His childhood was a blank. No birth certificate, no baptismal record, no surviving family. But in the ruins of his correspondence, torn letters, coded ledgers and receipts tucked in hollowed-out books, investigators uncovered something far more chilling. He hadn't been working alone. There were names. Abbreviated at first, MC in Baltimore, DW in Philadelphia, RT in Richmond, each tied to funeral parlors, anatomy schools, or city health boards. The language in the letters was coded, but unmistakable. Received shipment 7B, condition excellent. Request 2 adults, 1 child, prefer spleens intact. Salt levels low last batch. Ice routing compromised. Advise delay. 1 envelope bore an embossed crest, a scalpel crossing a sprig of laurel encircled by the Latin phrase Memoriae per mortem. Through death we remember. The society's name was never written outright, but internally they called it the Post-Mortem Exchange. It wasn't a cult. It was worse. A business alliance. A network of morticians, graveyard keepers and medical suppliers who shared more than inventory. They shared ideology. That bodies were being wasted. That cities weren't burying. They were discarding. And if the poor had no voice in life, they could still serve in death. Records showed shipments between St. Louis, Baltimore, Philadelphia and Cincinnati. Routes labeled only by weight and freshness. One ledger alone accounted for over 700 units in 4 years. They used salt, ice and prayer books as packaging material. They hollowed out coffins to reuse them. They used stillborn infants to pad larger shipments, cheaper, easier to hide. And at the center of it all was Griggs, but not as a leader, as a facilitator. He wasn't the mastermind. He was the middleman, efficient, discreet, obsessively detail-oriented, the kind of man who never asked where the shipments went, only how soon they needed to leave. The Tribune published the findings under the headline, "Death for Sale, a Nation's Silent Trade." And with that, the story changed. No longer a tale of one madman, but the revelation of a system, and Griggs was just its cleanest face. In the margins of Griggs' journals, scrawled between shipments and codes, were phrases that didn't belong to commerce. They belonged to worship. He called it his holy work. He didn't see himself as a butcher or even a facilitator. He was a guardian of the discarded, a midwife to what came after death. His pen trembled most when writing not of logistics, but of revelation. "The poor do not die in vain," he wrote. "They are chosen. Stripped of worldly burden, they pass clean into utility. In their flesh lies a new covenant." He believed that by dissecting the unclaimed, he was granting them purpose beyond the grave, turning forgotten lives into eternal contributions to knowledge, healing, and what he called the structure of divine memory. He didn't just sell organs. He believed he was preserving souls. In one fevered entry, he described a dream in which the body of a young boy, unnamed, jaw fractured, spoke to him during embalming. He asked not to be buried. He begged to be useful. His eye wept fluid long after death. It was a sign. He began to mark certain corpses with symbols, crosses, spirals, even passages from scripture written in blood. These, he believed, were the elect. Their parts were to be handled with reverence, their remains catalogued not for profit, but for resurrection. The ear remembers song, the hand remembers prayer, the spine remembers kneeling. And then, in bold, centered on a yellowed page smeared with wax, he wrote, "I free them from rot. I make them immortal." He claimed to hear God's voice during dissection, the silence of the body giving space for divine instruction, that each incision was a hymn, each bone a verse. To others, his work was horror. To Griggs, it was liturgical. The law now hunted him. The public feared him. But Griggs believed he had already transcended both. Because when you make death a sacrament, the grave is no longer an ending. It becomes an altar. They called her mad. But grief sharpens over time. Hardened into resolve, it stops asking for permission. Margaret Sullivan, the mother who once screamed barefoot in the streets, became something else, a symbol, a spear point. She gathered others like her, women whose children vanished in hospital basements, wives whose husbands were buried too quickly, sisters denied viewings and told simply to move on. They called themselves the Black Veil Mothers, and they came to dig. With borrowed shovels, with rusted spades and blistered hands, they marched to the city's pauper fields, the unmarked graves Griggs was paid to fill. They didn't ask for legal sanction. They demanded it. The Tribune ran their photo on the front page, 27 women in black, veils pulled high, sleeves rolled, eyes sharp. No protest signs, just tools. The city finally relented. Under armed supervision, 23 graves were opened. What they found stunned even the police. 15 of them were empty. The coffins were real, but filled with bricks, animal bones, straw, or nothing at all. One contained a child's blanket, folded neatly, still damp with decay. 3 coffins held partial remains, limbs, torsos, fragments surgically removed. Only 5 bodies were found whole. The rest, gone. Margaret's son, Eli, was not among them. She stood at his supposed grave, hands clenched at her sides, and said nothing. No wail, no collapse. Just a single sentence, spoken to the wind. "You stole him twice." News spread like fire. Church bells tolled for the exhumed. Mourners arrived from other cities. The governor issued an apology on behalf of the state. Too late, too shallow. Now, it wasn't just the horror of what Griggs had done. It was the certainty. The people no longer whispered. They wept, yes. But they also began to dig. Because in St. Louis, the ground was no longer sacred. And every grave had become a question. The flood of headlines reached the capital within days. St. Louis's dead never buried. Bodies sold. Souls stolen. Missouri's graveyard scandal rocks the nation. Every paper from Boston to San Francisco carried some version of the horror. Politicians raged. Priests wept. The American Medical Association issued a statement disavowing all unauthorized cadaver procurement, while quietly deleting names from their faculty rosters. And then the governor acted. He dispatched a militia unit to St. Louis, not to maintain peace, but to seize control. Within hours, the city morgue, municipal archive, and even Griggs' mortuary were placed under armed guard. Record clerks were marched out, files boxed, contracts seized, bribes frozen mid-payment. They went not just after Griggs, but the system he'd served. The effect was immediate. 6 city officials resigned within 72 hours. The chief medical examiner vanished overnight. One councilman was arrested attempting to burn financial ledgers in his fireplace. Public trust collapsed, and the funerals began. But not for the dead, for the absent. Across the city, families who had once been denied closure now staged ceremonial burials, with empty caskets, folded shawls, framed photographs, even bits of gravel where bones should have lain. They filled the cemeteries again, not with corpses, but with sorrow. Margaret Sullivan, still veiled, stood beside an unmarked grave and read a letter aloud, written to her son Eli, now presumed dissected, incinerated, or buried far from where he belonged. "You are still mine," she said, "no matter what they took, no matter where they sent you. I remember you whole." The city wept with her. In churches, bells rang for hours. On porches, candles flickered into the night. Teachers paused lessons to read the names of the exhumed, those that had names. But none of it restored what had been stolen. The bodies were gone. The records, corrupted. The truth, buried alongside them. Still, something had changed. Because for the first time in St. Louis history, the dead were being mourned by strangers. Not because they were known, but because they had been forgotten. They called it mourning. But it looked like a revolution. The funeral parades that once moved quietly through city streets began to swell in size and volume. Caskets, most of them empty, were hoisted high not in sorrow, but in defiance. Mothers, widows, laborers, and schoolchildren marched behind them, holding signs painted in blood-red ink. "We remember what you buried. No name, still human. The dead are watching." Bagpipes played not hymns, but dirges written that year, new songs for the forgotten dead. One, titled "Bone and Ash," echoed from rooftops and saloons alike. Its final verse chanted like a threat. "You took their breath, you stole their skin, but we still speak for what's within." Churches, once complicit in silence, now roared from their pulpits. Sermons denounced scientific desecration, likening Griggs's network to sacrilege. One preacher compared the post-mortem exchange to the selling of indulgences, a betrayal not just of the body, but of the soul. Even the Cathedral of St. Louis hung its bell in black cloth. Vigils lit up every neighborhood. Families who had no proof of loss stood together with candles, chanting names both real and imagined. In graveyards, strangers began leaving flowers on unmarked plots. No names, just a note pinned beneath the petals. "If no one remembers you, I will." The city's identity, once rooted in industry and ambition, began to warp under the weight of its buried shame. Children whispered stories about haunted wagons, pulled by invisible horses, still wandering alleys at night. Tourists stopped calling it the gateway to the West. They called it something else. The Hollow City, not for its buildings, but for the emptiness beneath them. Because now everyone knew. St. Louis had once made its name on railroads, on commerce, on steel. But beneath that progress, it had been built, quite literally, on missing bones. And the deeper people dug, the more they wondered, what else had the city paved over? The protests reached their boiling point in early October, when a crowd of mourners turned away from the cemeteries and toward the very places that had consumed the dead. The St. Elias Medical Institute, long rumored to have accepted shipments from Griggs, became the first target. It began as a candlelight vigil. Students stood at the gates, some silently holding signs, others reading from the Tribune's reprinted ledger pages. But when a janitor appeared with a crate of formalin-soaked cadavers, laughter was heard from an upper window. Someone, no one remembers who, threw the first stone. By dusk, the crowd surged through the gates. Windows shattered, doors splintered, professors fled down stairwells. 2 were caught in the lecture hall and beaten unconscious with wooden stools. Others barricaded themselves inside the anatomy lab, huddled behind cabinets filled with dissected limbs. The cadaver vault was dragged into the street. Flammable chemicals soaked the walls. Fire roared through the first floor, then the second. By dawn, the building was ash and rubble. No one claimed responsibility. But within a week, 4 other dissection halls, 2 in Missouri, 1 in Illinois, 1 in Ohio, closed their doors indefinitely. Across the country, medical colleges scrambled to rewrite their policies. Cadaver sourcing laws, long ignored, were suddenly enforced. Permits were demanded. Autopsy procedures were overhauled. Anatomy professors gave public statements condemning the trade they had silently sustained for years. But it was all too late. The public didn't want apologies. They wanted the dead returned, and the academic world had no means, legal or spiritual, to do that. Journalists coined a new term for the backlash: the resurrection riots, and though few bodies were found, many were avenged. Griggs was never mentioned by name at these protests anymore. He had become something else. Not a man, not even a monster, but a symbol of everything the powerful had hidden, behind medicine, behind science, behind progress. And as his victims burned in the very buildings that had cut them open, the world finally asked the question it should have asked years before. What price did we pay for knowledge? After the fires, after the resignations, after the exhumations, and the weeping and the parades of empty caskets, Alpheus Griggs was still gone, but only in body. His name, his shape, his shadow, those were everywhere. In Davenport, Iowa, a traveling apothecary set up shop selling bone powder for vitality. Locals said he walked with his hands always gloved, eyes always down. He left after a week. The scent of lavender lingered for 3 more. In Cairo, Illinois, a clergyman preached at a riverfront revival. He wore a collar with no cross and quoted scripture that didn't exist. He disappeared before his second sermon. In Terre Haute, a sailor was seen loading heavy crates onto a riverboat marked only with initials, AG. He never returned from the voyage. The boat did. None of these men were confirmed to be Griggs, but they were all him. Children whispered that he slept beneath their floorboards, that if you saw a man in black walking alone at sunrise, you were next. That you could tell it was him by the smell, not of blood or rot, but of lavender, faint and sickly sweet, trailing like incense before a sacrament. The sightings became so frequent that newspapers stopped printing them. Some towns posted notices, "No lavender on premises." Others held nighttime watches. One community in Missouri exhumed all 5 of its graves and found them intact, but still declared itself a Griggs-free zone. The man had become a myth, too large to capture, too vivid to ignore. Stories began to blur the line between horror and scripture. One tale said he'd become immortal, kept alive by the very bodies he sold. Another claimed he was assembling the perfect body from 1,000 pieces. waiting for the night he could breathe into it. No facts, no arrests, only footprints that vanished mid-step. And the scent. That lavender scent. The city tried to forget. But legends, like corpses, don't decay the way they should, especially when they've been embalmed in fear. It arrived without a return address, folded inside a stained envelope sealed with wax. Black, not red. The paper was brittle. Ink faded at the edges. But the handwriting was unmistakable, precise, vertical, almost reverent. The envelope was addressed simply St. Louis Tribune, for publication or burning. Inside were 8 pages, untitled, numbered, every margin packed, every line tight. No edits, no hesitation. It began, "You do not bury your dead. You discard them." The letter claimed to be Griggs's final confession. A farewell not of remorse, but of justification. A sermon more than a statement. It contained no apology, only a vision. "I watched you waste them. You're poor, you're sick, you're unseen. You cried over names but never knew their voices. You mourned rot, not remembrance. I gave them new meaning." He wrote of death as architecture, a structure built from sacrifice. He spoke of his victims as the raw saints chosen by circumstance, purified through separation. They had no more use for their bodies, but I did, and so did the world. Each age spiraled deeper into theology and madness. He cited scripture that didn't exist. He quoted surgeons like philosophers. He compared the scalpel to the communion wafer, both instruments of transformation. On page 6, he described a dream, a mountain of stitched bodies rising from the earth, lit from within, eyes glowing like oil lamps, each one breathing his name. "I do not fear God. I prepare him." He claimed the city had always known, that its silence was consent, that every false signature, every ignored shipment, every closed casket had been an unspoken prayer. Deliver us from knowing. The final page was short, just 3 lines, centered on the page, written in thicker ink. "I told the truth. You called it desecration. I showed you what death was worth. You tried to bury it. Bury this truth if you dare." The editors hesitated for days. Then they published it in full. The public read it like scripture, like heresy, like a map of the abyss. Because now the question wasn't just where Griggs had gone. It was, what had he become? They thought the nightmare was over, that the last barrel had been found, the final ledger published, the echo of Griggs's name finally fading. Then workers excavating a drainage line beneath the old St. Louis City morgue struck a stone wall where no wall should be. Behind it lay a narrow stairwell, spiraling downward into cold, airless dark. At the bottom, a vault, long forgotten or never recorded, sealed by stone and salt. The door was marked not with words, but with a faint spiral carved into the frame. What lay inside would haunt the city forever. Rows of preserved bodies, arranged like museum pieces. Some lay on stone slabs, dissected mid-process, rib cages open, eyes removed, scalpel incisions paused like someone had simply stepped away for a moment. Others were posed. One woman sat upright in a wooden chair, hands folded, eyes stitched shut with black thread. A child stood against the wall, encased in wax, dressed in a school uniform, smiling. Several were incomplete, missing parts catalogued in Griggs's notes. Yet their flesh had been treated, preserved, protected from time, as if they were waiting to be reassembled. But it was the final discovery that broke the silence. One of the investigators, a young man named Harold Burr, touched the hand of a figure resting against the wall, a man's torso, arms bound across the chest. The hand twitched. Not a spasm, not decay. The body was warm. They unwrapped the chest. Inside, they found an organ preservation rig still running. Tubes delivering brine. The lungs had collapsed long ago, but the brain showed signs of recent activity. Griggs had stored him alive. How many others had entered the vault still breathing, only to be turned into specimens, conscious, paralyzed, and forgotten? The vault was sealed by order of the governor. The official statement claimed the bodies were post-mortem, a preservation experiment gone wrong. But the city knew, because silence does not always mean death. And in the stillness of that vault, something had been listening. The numbers had never added up. Not in the morgue, not in the cemeteries, not in the coroner's books. So when the governor commissioned a full audit of city death records between 1865 and 1877, few expected consistency. What they found was worse. Over 600 death certificates were missing, names never entered into public logs, causes of death unlisted, burial sites unrecorded or false. Hundreds more bore suspicious details: blank witness lines, missing family contacts, identical handwriting copied across multiple forms. The missing were not elites. They were paupers, orphans, immigrants who had arrived in the city with nothing but breath, and left with even less. Entire boarding houses were accounted for, but none of their residents appeared in cemetery plots. Hospital wings emptied overnight during outbreaks, yet no mass burial sites existed to match the timing. One grave held a woman named Mary O'Connor. The same name appeared in 3 different cemeteries across 3 years, each time with a different age. Griggs had used names like placeholders. Bodies weren't buried. They were filed under invented aliases and sold under real ones. And when you disappear the poor, no one checks. He knew that. His records showed meticulous attention to vulnerability. Margins included notations: no family, new arrival, no parish, father incarcerated, mother deceased, child alone, indigent ward, no inquiry expected. He didn't choose at random. He chose with certainty. The census team published their findings in a report titled The Forgotten Ledger. It listed every unaccounted name, every mismatched burial, every impossible document. No one was prosecuted. Too many departments had signed off. Too many years had passed. Too much dirt had been turned. But the report became something else. People carried it like scripture, read it aloud at vigils, stamped the missing names onto brass plates and nailed them to church doors, not as justice, but as remembrance. Because in the world Griggs helped build, forgetting was the first cut, and silence the most efficient scalpel. What began in St. Louis rippled outward like blood in water. By spring of 1878, new burial laws were being drafted in 8 states. By summer, it was 23. Missouri led the charge, mandating that every burial be witnessed by 2 unrelated individuals, that all cadaver shipments be registered with the state, and that unclaimed bodies be held for a mandatory 90-day review before release to medical institutions. Other states followed suit. Permits were now required to transport human remains across county lines. Dissection labs were placed under inspection. Even private mortuaries were ordered to submit to random audits. It became known unofficially as Griggs's Law. The funeral industry, once trusted without question, found itself under a magnifying glass. Morticians were no longer seen as guardians of dignity, but potential merchants of decay. Dozens of smaller funeral parlors shuttered their doors rather than face investigation. Medical colleges scrambled to source bodies legally. Public campaigns urged citizens to donate with dignity. Consent forms were printed, ethical boards formed. But beneath all the regulation, one truth remained: the demand never stopped. Surgeons still needed cadavers, Students still needed practice, researchers still needed the unclaimed, and even with all the scrutiny, death continued its march. Only now, it wore a different uniform. Institutions found new loopholes, foreign bodies, prisoners. The deeply poor who didn't speak English, couldn't read the consent forms, or simply never came home. The ledger Griggs once kept in shadows was now a spreadsheet, filed under grants and ethics clauses. His name faded from the news, but his system, cleaner, sanctioned, rebranded, persisted. Because the world had learned a terrible lesson. What's illegal in the dark becomes necessary in the light, if you just call it by the right name. They buried the law in clean language. They buried the scandal in time. But they never truly buried the business. Because in medicine, in death, in systems built on flesh, the body is always worth something. Years passed. The name Griggs faded from headlines, then from conversations, then from memory, spoken only in hushed tones by archivists and old coroners with twitching hands. But the pieces he scattered never disappeared. They simply changed location. At a university museum in Ohio, a glass case holds a perfectly dissected human arm, muscles peeled back layer by layer, nerves suspended in wax like silver threads. The tag reads, Specimen 44B, circa 1870, origin unknown. At a cabinet of curiosities in Pennsylvania, a child's skull sits beneath a bell jar, small teeth intact, the cranial plate opened and sewn shut again with gold wire. A guest once asked the curator where it came from. It was found in a barrel, he said, near St. Louis, long ago. In a basement medical archive in Baltimore, a collection labeled Historic Anatomy Models, Unverified Sources, remains restricted to faculty only. Among them, a full human spine, a preserved larynx, and what appears to be an infant's heart, blackened with time, floating in silence. No names, no backstory, no permission. Records from these institutions are vague. Some claim donation, others cite acquisition through now-defunct suppliers. A few admit they don't know at all, only that the specimens were received during the Griggs years. Volunteers have attempted to catalogue these artifacts, comparing preservation techniques, handwriting styles on original labels, transport crates with identical nails and joints. In several cases, wax stamps found on the base of display jars match the pattern burned into Griggs's stolen ledgers, but none of the bodies have ever been identified. No family ever came forward, no grave was ever dug. So they remain, behind glass, on quiet shelves, in forgotten wings of buildings no longer used for teaching, but still unlocked, still open to the curious, still visible. The children in school field trips don't ask who, see arm it was. They marvel at how clean the muscle folds, how perfect the dissection. But the scent, faint beneath the chemical fog, lingers. Not of dust, not of age. Lavender. The dead are not gone. They are displayed. It became a rumor whispered among surgical students at a certain East Coast university, never confirmed, never officially acknowledged. But everyone in the anatomy lab knew about AG-12. It was a cadaver, or so the records claimed, male, approximate age 40, preserved in formalin, encased in waxed linen, assigned to Group 12 during the fall dissection cycle. From the outside it looked no different than the others, until they made the first incision, and the body bled. Not in gushes, not in spurts, but in slow, deliberate droplets, thick, dark and warm, as if something inside refused to let go. Students dismissed it as residual fluid, a preservative anomaly. But every time the blade touched, it bled again. One night, a student nicked the wrist. The hand curled. They left the lab early that evening. The next morning, the body had been rotated, face turned slightly, mouth cracked open. The instructors said nothing, but the logbook was quietly altered. AG-12 was reassigned. Group 12 was given a replacement cadaver, The original was wheeled into a storage chamber and never spoken of again. Only the tag remained, AG-12, marked in looping cursive, older than the others. No school records matched its origin. No consent forms. No transport logs. Just those initials. Age Alpheus Griggs. No one knew. No one dared to ask. But over the years, instructors passed down warnings wrapped in jest. Don't nick the wrong artery, or AG-12 might sit up. If it bleeds, stop cutting. Some specimens aren't meant to be opened. Eventually, AG-12 vanished from the vaults. Whether destroyed, buried, or locked away, no one could say. But the stories remained. And in every lab where the lights flickered, where the air turned too still, where lavender clung to gloves without explanation, the students remembered. Because some bodies aren't cadavers, they're reminders. It took 12 years for the city to erect a stone, not because they forgot Eli Sullivan, but because they couldn't find him. No remains were ever recovered, no coffin, no trace, just ledger entries, rumors, and a single line in the Tribune that read, "Boy 10, presumed lost to the trade." But his mother never stopped visiting the empty plot she'd once been told was his. She came every Sunday, even after the vigils ended, even after the crowds thinned, even after her own hair went silver and her voice withered from shouting. She would sit in the grass for hours, not crying, not praying, just waiting. When she died, the city finally gave in. A small memorial stone was placed at the foot of the hill, just outside St. Gabriel's old boundary wall. Not in the official cemetery, but close enough. It read, Eli Sullivan, 1867 to 1877. A child taken twice, Margaret Sullivan, mother. She never stopped remembering. The grave became a curiosity at first, then a pilgrimage. Students, tourists, and local children began to leave trinkets, toy wagons, paper D, ulls, school ribbons. Someone carved a small spiral into the base of the stone. No one admitted it. And then came the scent. Visitors began to report it in the still air above the soil. Lavender, faint, sweet, persistent. No flowers were ever planted, no oils poured. But the scent lingered. Some claimed they saw footprints appear in the dew around the grave, small, barefoot. Others said they heard a child's voice humming from beneath the ground. But no one dared dig. Even when new cemetery maps showed inconsistencies, even when ground-penetrating scans showed an object buried deeper than the rest. The grave remained untouched. Because Eli's story was no longer just about a boy lost to greed. It had become a warning. Some graves are meant to stay empty, and some memories refuse to be exhumed. They say the ground never truly settles in St. Louis, especially not in the old cemetery rows, the ones near the riverbank, where the graves are shallow and the names long faded. Fog clings there longer. Even on warm mornings, even when the sun rises clean. It moves unnaturally, curling low, as if tracing shapes beneath the soil. Groundkeepers whisper about tools gone missing. Shovels left by headstones vanish overnight. Wheelbarrows turn up 3 plots away. Gloves, candles, ledger pens all vanish, then reappear in strange places, sometimes bent, sometimes burned, and always cold. After heavy storms, the cemetery workers arrive early. They know what they'll find. Bones, ribs protruding like claws, vertebrae washed loose. Once, a child's mandible resting in the crook of a tree root, still wrapped in burial cloth. They bury them again. Of course they do. But not before the scent hits them. Lavender, not from flowers, not from oil, from the earth itself. There are no records for many of these plots. They're marked by hand-chiseled stones or bent iron stakes. Some have no markers at all, just mounds that sink further each year. Locals don't picnic there. No weddings are staged nearby. The city once tried to pave a sidewalk through the area. The bricks sank overnight. Tourists sometimes visit, drawn by the legends. They take photos, stay for an hour, but they always leave before dusk. The priests no longer bless those rows. One minister tried. He returned to the church pale and silent, and never preached again. People say it's not the ghosts of the dead that haunt that ground. It's the unfinished ritual. The interruption of what should have been sacred. The severed memory of lives erased not by time, but by commerce. And somewhere in the dark, Griggs's name lingers, not as a man, but as a presence. Not a soul to be feared, but a legacy that refuses to stay buried. Because when the body becomes a transaction, the earth remembers the debt. Alpheus, Griggs disappeared. His name faded from headlines. His photo was never confirmed. His remains were never found. But his method, it never died. The systems he navigated, the contracts, the corruption, the silence, were not destroyed. They were refined. His ledgers became spreadsheets. His wagons became shipping firms. His barrels became refrigerated trucks. And the poor, the voiceless, the unclaimed, they still disappear. In modern hospitals, there are still bodies no one identifies. In prisons, there are still deaths that don't make the books. In refugee camps, disaster zones, border crossings and forgotten wards, people vanish into medical labs, training facilities, and supply chains that never publish their sources. You won't see the names, but the trade is alive. Ask the anatomy students who are told not to ask where their cadavers came from. Ask the janitors who clean surgical practice rooms late at night. Ask the researchers who request low-visibility specimens for high-risk procedures. Ask the mothers who wait for remains that never return. New names, new uniforms, new titles. Same economy, because where there is science, there is demand. Where there is death, there is profit. And where there are people no one remembers, there will always be a Griggs. Perhaps not as a man in black with gloved hands and lavender-scented halls, but as a system that rewards silence, as a ledger without a soul. And maybe, just maybe, if you walk too close to the wrong wing of a forgotten building, if you see a crate left at a loading dock with no label, if you smell something floral in a place it shouldn't be, stop. Look down. And remember, not everything buried stays buried. And if you think the dead are safe now, you haven't looked beneath your city. Subscribe to the Macabre record. Because the most horrifying stories, they're not fiction. They're just the ones no one dared to dig up. Until now,